The US Department of Justice is waging war on one of the most successful companies on the planet, Apple. Here is Attorney General Merrick Garland.
For over a decade, iPhone sales have made up a majority of Apple's annual revenue. Today, Apple's share of the U.S. performance smartphone market exceeds 70%, and its share of the entire U.S. smartphone market exceeds 65%. Apple charges as much as nearly $1,600 for an iPhone. But as our complaint alleges, Apple has maintained monopoly power in the smartphone market not simply by staying ahead of the competition on the merits, but by violating federal antitrust law.
The complaint that the Department of Justice is launching, I think it's very important to recognize, is being launched in our name, in my name, in your name. It's that Apple, in selling us, here's the iPhone that I use, if I can get it on camera here, that in selling me an iPhone that I use for recreation, that I use in my work, that I basically am using every part of the day, is exploiting me, is victimizing me, is making profits at my expense. And if you actually value Apple as a company, and Apple is an unusual company, and it has a real fan base, so there's a lot of people who recognize the value of Apple, who watch when they're launching new products, who go online and use their iPhone or iPad or Mac to watch these presentations. It has a huge fan base. And if you really are a fan of what Apple has created, this is a real opportunity to speak up in its name. The Department of Justice, as I said, is saying Apple's victimizing you. And you can write to your government officials and say, no, I'm not a victim of Apple. I'm a beneficiary of all the things that they've created. It's something that I really value, and that it's a perversion of justice to be going after them for their success and for what they've created. And I mean, we're in an election year here in the US, and you can tell your officials that, like, I can't support someone who doesn't think of Apple as this is an American success story, not an American thug who's exploiting all of us.
I want to stress the significance of this case and why we're doing this special episode of New Ideal Live. This is a monumentally important case. It's going to unfold over many years. It's going to be a huge, huge cost on Apple's time and all of our attention. And it is important not primarily or even only or primarily as a legal issue. I think it's a moral issue for the reasons you were indicating, Onkar. I think this is a moral travesty. Apple has achieved something stupendous. I don't think anything like this has been achieved before in the tech space. And it has earned every step of the way. It has created, people might not remember the time before iPhones. I'm sure there are a lot of people who are so young that they've grown up with iPhones and the Apple ecosystem, but all of that didn't exist 25 years ago. It didn't exist 20 years ago in many products. I remember a life without those things. I remember life without the iPod, without the iTunes store. I remember having to buy CD-ROMs and DVDs and things like that, and you couldn't stream things. And Apple broke the music industry apart and innovated on a massive scale. And now we have streaming music as a given. And Apple isn't even the leader in that market. Then we get the iPhone in 2007, which was just a game-changing device. It wasn't the first smartphone, but it was the iPhone that created a new market and created new demand for something that people didn't know they needed. They didn't know they needed an internet device, an iPod, and a phone all in one thing. And then Apple succeeded in making it massively popular by making the phone a delight to use, really integrated with other Apple devices. Every piece of that, every piece of the ecosystem, and then the development of the App Store for creating new additional software for the phone that didn't come from the factory. All of that was an innovation. Every step of the way, And this is, I think it's instrumental to Apple's success as becoming one of the most valued companies on the planet, and valued, I think, rightly valued. I don't think it's one of those uh, tech companies that people inflate its value. It sells in a stupendous amount of smartphones. The iPhone, I believe, is its biggest product. It dwarfs the Mac, which is what Apple built its business on in the first few decades of its existence. And this is way more, it creates more value in people's lives, at least in my life, and I'm sure in many other millions of users' lives. It creates more value than I've paid to Apple over the years. And I have a lot of Apple products right here on my desk, on my wrist, all around my house. Many more Apple products than most people, because I really appreciate the integration that they create. And I have to say, it's whatever the cost is, I'm happy to pay it. There's never been a moment where I felt exploited. I don't think it's objective to even think of it as exploitation. It's completely a voluntary trade. And that's part of the injustice here, is that, as you put it, this is in the name of American citizens. As an American citizen, I repudiate this. This is not in my name. And I will be taking action to make that known to the political representatives in my area, because this is a travesty. This is the cutting down of a successful company precisely because of its earned success. And I think that's the moral significance here. There's a lot to say about the legal case and the legal architecture of antitrust, and we'll say a bit more about that in today's discussion. But that's the moral issue. It's being attacked, and this war against it is being waged precisely because it has achieved so much value, and that is, I think, that is corrupt.
And I haven't read the whole of the document, that it's an 88-page document that the DOJ has released, that's putting forth their claims against Apple, but I've read parts of it, and it's clear that Apple is the target because it's enormously profitable. And that, as you pointed out, versus some other tech companies, they have a high valuation where people think, well, they'll eventually become profitable. Like Amazon was like that. It didn't make profits for a lot of years. And there was questions of, like, does it have the value that it's being accorded by the market? There's no question in regard to Apple that it is so enormously valuable because it's actually making profits. And that is treated as a sin by the Department of Justice. That and it's making profits over years. And part of the idea that could these products be exploitative? If you bought an iPhone and then found, like, yeah, there's nothing good about this, it's just like any other smartphone, I could buy a smartphone for $50 or $100. If people thought of it like that, if that was their actual experience with these products, it would be, I'm not buying an iPhone. Part of the DOJ's whole objection is people keep buying Apple products. And they view that as, like, you're locked into this system, you can't get out. But what that really means is their experience with the products is, these are so good, yeah, I want the next version of the iPhone or the iPad, and they upgrade, and so they stay within the ecosystem. It's true that Apple wants them to stay within the ecosystem, but the only reason people stay is because they find it so valuable. And that is, the Department of Justice is, no, we're going to override your individual decisions. You don't really know what's good for you. We know how the market should be operating, what companies should be doing, what prices they should be selling things at. And so we're going to override the market. And what that means is that it's going to override your ability to gain the kinds of values that you actually are gaining from Apple.
One quick thought on that, and then I want to sketch out some of the claims against Apple. So you pointed out how this is overriding the judgment of people in their voluntary trade with Apple, when they line up outside the Apple store to buy the latest iPhone, when they watch the latest product releases. I am one of those people who watched the release of the iPhone in 2007, and I try to watch them as often as I can when they release new products. It's exciting. It's inspiring when when a company like that isn't a niche, that kind of event is not a niche viewing experience. A lot of people are interested in what's the latest innovative thing that Apple's going to do. And the other side of this overriding of people's judgment is where this is leading. So if this suit is successful in prosecuting Apple, it's going to override Apple's judgment. It's not clear what kind of remedy the government will seek. One of the things that's been talked about is breaking up the company. What we do know from past cases is that whether it's broken up or not, the intervention of the remedy, whatever that looks like, almost always means overriding the company's own business judgment. And that we saw that with the Microsoft case, and we see that with others, which means that insofar as Apple is successfully creating new products that people want to buy, they literally line up outside the store. They pre-order multi-$1,000 products online because they want them. Apple is going to have to then face living in a cage, basically. Like, we can't take this step, we can't innovate in this space, we can't add this business line, we can't create this product, because then we'll violate the strictures of whatever antitrust constraints are imposed upon them. And that is the death knell of innovation. That's the death knell of a company and the value that is created. Even if it hobbles on, and even if it has a rebirth, it's an attack on the best features of the company, which is the ability to create new products, to think of innovative business models, which it has. I mean, I don't think the App Store concept existed before it was created by Apple in this scale and with the ease of use that we've seen. And other companies have modeled themselves on that. So all of that, I think, it's an attack on the judgment both of the people buying the product and the people creating the product. Let's say a few things about what some of these accusations. I don't want to spend time refuting the accusations, and we might do another episode talking about that, because I think there's a mistake that a lot of people make in trying to rebut them, and we'll come to that. But let's just first lay out some of the accusations in the Justice Department's claim. And I haven't finished reading the whole legal document, but I've read enough, and I've read some of the summaries of it. So here are the headline claims, and there might be others, and we can talk about them another time. So one is that the iPhone is a monopoly that locks people in from switching to other competitor devices. The second is that it blocks other competing cloud services from offering products on Apple devices. And I think that is often in the context of gaming and being able to do transactions outside of Apple's commission structure. The idea that we talked about this before we went live, and I think this is really worth stressing. The idea that Apple degrades the quality of messaging to devices other than Apple. So if you've used an Apple device, you know that it has built-in messaging that looks like text messaging, but it's enhanced and it has other features than text messaging. But if you're communicating with someone outside the Apple ecosystem, it looks different, has different features. And that's typically if someone's on Android or another kind of device. And that is true. They give you a different experience if you're dealing with someone who's not on an iPhone. And that, I think, is a feature. And I think it's a valuable feature. And that's part of what makes the phone appealing, because people like using iMessage. There are advantages to it. But I think it's useful if you bring up some of what's said in the document about this and how there's a ludicrousness about it that is important to stress about the way they're approaching this whole issue.
Yeah, and this is, it goes back to the issue of it's really being done in your name. So in this case, it's being done in the name of the children who are supposedly being exploited by Apple, and that they do this kind of thing that it can look like you're on an Android phone, and that's a kind of second-class experience. They put it that there's a social stigma attached. This is in paragraph 90, page 38 of the document. So this is a quote. Many non-iPhone users also experience social stigma, exclusion, and blame for breaking chats where other participants own iPhones. This effect is particularly powerful for certain demographics, like teenagers, where the iPhone share is 85%, according to one survey. This social pressure reinforces switching costs and drives users to continue buying iPhones. So they're trying to make it, you're buying an iPhone not because you find it really valuable, it's so easy to use. There's a social stigma attached to, if you had some other phone, people will look down upon you. And that's the reason you're using an iPhone. And that's how the Apple's exploiting you. And I mean, the word for that is BS.
I want to point out, so you mentioned at the beginning that Apple has a big fan base. So over and above the people who buy the products, there's a sub community of people who are, I think I'm one of them, who are really interested in what Apple does, follow it very closely. And I think in the early years, they were thought of as evangelists. Oh, you need to switch to Mac from PCs. So there was this whole community of people who are really supportive of it. But I think it's grown to a scale that I don't think there are other tech companies that have this kind of loyal following. So, people not as committed as I am, perhaps, in terms of the fandom, but it's a significant fan base. And I think that's relevant for thinking about some of the initial reactions. And we'll need to come back to this antitrust case again and again because it's going to unfold. But just since this was announced, I've seen some commentary on this, both from people who are following Apple, who are industry commentators and analysts, and people just reading on the Washington Post website the commentary around this article. There's a lot of comments already from people, and I haven't read them all, but I read enough that I think this is an accurate picture of the flavor. A lot of people are dumbfounded because their reaction is similar to what you said. So I bought this phone because I wanted it, and I kept it because it gives me the value that I want. And I'm surprised that there's an antitrust case on the issue of Apple devices working better with Apple devices. If you have an iPhone and an Apple Watch, they're designed to integrate well. And so someone on the Washington Post website says, well, I have a Garmin watch and it works fine with my iPhone, so what's the big deal? I don't see any friction here. So people have a firsthand experience with, well, it's not as big a deal as you think it is, or it's not an issue at all for me. And so I think there's this reaction to, well, this doesn't make sense. Then from some commentators in this space, there's even more surprise because they go through these accusations about degraded messaging on the apps, the iMessage versus Android, the idea of being locked into Android. And the part of what I've seen is commentators try to refute each of these claims. Like it's really not true that you can't exit and move to Android. There are apps to help you do it, and it's not that difficult. And I think the reaction is well founded because, as you put it, so much of this is just on the face of it BS. But I think it's a mistake to think that this case turns on the facts. I think it doesn't. It's a mistake to think of this as it's basically. Is there a wrong here? Is there a crime here? And the way to answer that is on the facts. Because I think there's something deeply wrong about that. I think it misses the nature of what antitrust is about. And I think antitrust there are facts here that are important, but I don't think it really hinges on that because antitrust as a legal framework just is non-objective. There's no way to get it right if you're a successful company. And I think that's the issue that needs to be understood. And for everyone who is either surprised or dumbfounded or even outraged the way I am, that's a crucial point to understand, that the antitrust laws are non-objective and they're fundamentally unjust. So they're lose-lose for the companies that are targeted. So Onkar, I just want to mention, so this is not the first time the Institute's taken a position in opposition to antitrust prosecutions. We do this on principle, and we've done it for decades. And one of the major campaigns we did was decades ago around the Microsoft case. And you were involved in writing some of the materials around that. So maybe you can give us a picture of how do you understand antitrust and maybe connected to the Microsoft case and how it differs here.
Antitrust it's like a guillotine hanging over the neck of every company, and it could be used against every company. It's really, if you're pursuing profits, you can be held in violation of some element of the antitrust laws. So the government has this kind of arbitrary and overwhelming power, and then it's at their discretion against which companies are they going to unleash this power. And what happened was and one of the reasons the US tech industry led the world is that it was free of government control and government interference. And the Microsoft case was a major turning point in that. In that, the Microsoft at the time of the case was the most successful tech company. It was making profits at the level that Apple is now making profits. Bill Gates was the richest person in the world at the time. And the government decided to use the antitrust laws against Microsoft. And one of the principal things, again, the idea that Microsoft was exploiting people, it was giving away an internet browser for free. It was before companies were charging. Now it's bundling it with the operating system, giving it away for free. That's how it was exploiting customers, by giving them a product for free. And so, it again, like that charge as, oh, that like that's exploitation, is BS. What the government was doing is trying to say, we view your profits as obscene. We're going to break you up unless you do, in fact, unless you take orders from us. And part of what is so crippling about antitrust is, if these were real laws, there would be all kinds of stories before the Department of Justice launches a case against, and it's gone after Microsoft, it then went after Google, it's now going after Apple. Before it launched it, there would be all kinds of news stories saying, well, Microsoft is breaking the law and doing this. And in this case, in Apple, it would have been, well, Apple in having a new iPhone, that's against the law, and having an app store, that's against the law. There's no stories like that, because in operating a business, what is a company trying to do? It's trying to make a profit, which means new products, superior products, developing the next version of it. And in the case of a lot of tech companies, of thinking of how you can keep people in your ecosystem, how you can keep using Apple products, keep using Google search, stay on Facebook and Instagram. The companies are all thinking about this. And if that was a crime, then all these companies, the essence of the business would be a crime. So the whole thing is, nobody thinks it's a crime until the Department of Justice says, no, we don't like how you're using this and in the particular way in which you're doing it. And so now we're launching and saying it's illegal. And any law where you can't tell beforehand if my action is legal or illegal is an invalid law. And antitrust is exactly like this. The companies are all operating, and then all of a sudden the Department of Justice says, no, what you're doing is illegal. And nobody could know beforehand that it would be regarded as illegal. And so that it's so crippling. You were telling, and one can see this, I think, in the operation of Microsoft after they lost the Department of the antitrust case against the Department of Justice. What will happen with Apple, one of the reasons it's so crippling, they will be continuously thinking, I've got to do this for the interest of the company and profits, of like, how do we make the app store even more attractive that people want to stay in here and use it? And it might be illegal. They can't say like what would be illegal if we do this. It's just anything we do might be regarded as illegal. And we've got no idea what it's going to be, like what we will be permitted to do, what will be declared off limits. And you're all at the mercy of government bureaucrats and like administrators. And that's such a crippling position to be in, to have no idea of what is legal and what isn't. And so that the default then is to do nothing, because you have no idea if what you do will be legal or not. And that's what creates stagnation. And that you saw Microsoft for almost a decade, basically a stagnant tech company. And that's almost like an oxymoron, that a tech company is stagnant. But that's what you saw. Microsoft now, because it's less likely they'll be in the crosshairs of the Department of Justice and the antitrust laws, has recuperated some. But the same thing that happened to Microsoft will happen to Apple if the Department of Justice is successful. And if you value Apple, it's certainly good to post comments on the Washington Post and so on, but write to your government officials to say that what the government is doing is perverse.
We should talk more about antitrust. Maybe we'll have another follow-up podcast once this case gets further down the road. I think I just want to flag for people who may not be aware that Ayn Rand wrote on antitrust extensively, and she characterized it as the rule of unreason. She thought it was, and this was, think about, it was heavy industry that was being targeted. Sometimes it was steel companies and major corporations. So this is well before the tech boom that we're living in and the information age. And what she was arguing at the time is that they're unenforceable, that you can't comply with them, and they're fundamentally contradictory. And as you were describing, that they put business people in this bind where they can't know whether the action that's in the best interest of their company is legal or not, and that's sort of a reign of terror, I think she called it.
Yeah, I think what you see is a real correlation that when antitrust laws are used, so they were first created and then expanded, but first created in the 19th century. But it's an arbitrary power that government could use. And when they actually use it, and when Ayn Rand was writing in the 1960s about the danger and the evils of antitrust laws, it's because they were actually being used by the government to persecute successful companies to the extent of putting the leaders of companies in jail for making profits and being too successful. In that kind of business atmosphere, what a businessman will think is, I can't be too successful, which means I can't innovate. I can't think about like moonshots and things like that. And the result is a kind of a narrowing of their horizon, a passivity, a lack of innovation, and so stagnation. And what it's not the only reason there was stagnation in the 1970s. She was writing about the persecution in the 1960s through antitrust law of successful American businesses like Alcoa, like the leaders in their field, that in the 70s you see enormous stagnation in the US economy. And one of the changes going into the 80s is antitrust laws were being used less by the government to persecute successful American companies. And you see a period of American growth. You see the rise of the tech industry, and it's very relevant that the tech industry was not persecuted by government until the Microsoft case in the late 90s into 2000. And that, as we talked about, that was a real shift. And the danger here now is that you've got, it's coming from academia, but it's impacted the government and politics. You have academics pushing that the antitrust laws should be revived and the government making use of this arbitrary power. It should make much more use of it to go after successful companies. And one of the leaders here, both in a kind of academic way and then involved in government, is Linda Kahn. We did a podcast on her and her attempts to revive antitrust a while ago. And she's being successful, and that kind of academic push is being successful. Particular targets are Amazon and Apple is one, Google's another. It's the most successful American companies. And if we now get into a climate for entrepreneurs, innovators, that they think, yeah, there's a really good chance antitrust laws will be used against me, a solution to that is just not to innovate, not to be the people pushing like a Steve Jobs, like pushing the world forward. And that just means more economic stagnation, less growth. And that hurts everybody, every productive person. If we have fewer Steve Jobs in the American economy, that it redounds to the whole economy and everybody's poor. And that's like that we're might be entering a climate like that. This is one of the reasons to stand up now versus when Apple's set as a precedent, and that every company can see, oh yeah, if I get as successful as Apple, I'm going to be persecuted. The time to make a stand is now.
And that's the thought I think we should leave people with, that this is a time to stand up and be counted. And if you care about freedom, if you care about the progress and innovation that is possible to the best minds in a society under freedom, which I think is what we're seeing in the tech space. It's one of the freest sectors. And this isn't true of Apple, but not only of Apple. It's true of the whole atmosphere around Silicon Valley, and the idea of people investing in new and disruptive technologies. If you care about that and you see the value of it in your own life, and you recognize that you are not a victim of Apple, you're not a victim of tech companies that you choose, whose products you choose to buy, then speak up. Do what you can. Speak in any forum that you have to anyone who will listen to you and who is open to persuasion that this is not just wrong on the legal merits or on the facts. It's fundamentally immoral. It's a persecution. It is corrupt, and it has to be stopped. And I think I would echo what you said, Onkar, earlier, which is that one of the most important things you can do is write to your political representatives and tell them that you do not want to see them do anything in this direction. You can't support them if they're on the side of the antitrust revival and this persecution of Apple in particular. A lot rides on this, and I think it's personally meaningful to everyone who has a smartphone, even if it's on an Apple device, because there would be no smartphone market, I think, absent Apple's innovations decades ago. And I think it's important to recognize that. So that's the key thing I want to encourage people to do. It's crucial to stand up against antitrust, and we hope you will do that in the days and months to come.